Pay you for that later. Thank you so much for coming to tonight's concert, and I'm grateful to get to play in this beautiful church here in Newport Beach. To me, I feel like, I live in Durango, Colorado. I feel like you're not in Kansas anymore, Dorothy, being here in Newport Beach. But that was The Easy Winners by Scott Joplin, who's considered the king of ragtime. He truly was one of the greatest American composers. But there were three gentlemen who were considered the greatest in that field of music: Scott Joplin, James Scott, and Joseph Lamb. They're called the Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms of ragtime. And I thought I'd start the concert by playing a piece written by each one of them for you. So next up we're going to do a Joe Lamb rag here from 1919 called the Bohemia Rag. Bohemia Rag by Joseph Lamb. Well, let's do one more by the big three here. We've got to do a rag by James Scott, who was from Carthage, Missouri. Many people believe that American music started in New Orleans with jazz, but it really started in Missouri with ragtime. And James Scott wrote dozens of wonderful rags. This one is from very late in the period, 1921, and it's called Don't Jazz Me Rag. By that time, jazz was already taking over, and apparently he didn't like it, so he wrote this piece, which is really wonderful. It's virtuosic, and it's called Don't Jazz Me Rag, subtitled I'm Music.
Music.
so I did. Well, not all ragtime sounded the same. In fact, it was not just piano music, and that's a misnomer today. You know, people sang more ragtime songs in vaudeville than they did play it on the piano. But it was also dance music, and I'm going to play for you a fun piece that I've been playing the last few months. It was written in 1914, and that year there was a craze for a dance called the half and half, which is in 5/4 time, which is very unusual. You know, most popular music's in duple meter, or you do a waltz and you count to 3. But this piece is written by a man named F. Henry Klickman, and it's called Drawing Room Echoes. It was a half and half dance. So here we go with a rag in 5/4 time. We'll see if I can do it. Thank you, folks. Think you could dance to that? A little tricky, right? Well, let me play a more familiar song for all of you. I'm going to try something now by the great Irving Berlin. No, Bob likes Irving Berlin. So we'll do this one. 1911, one of the greatest pop song hits of the ragtime years. We're going to play Alexander's Ragtime Band. And this is my big arrangement of it, which includes a whole bunch of songs going way back to the 19th century. Dixie and Yankee Doodle and A Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight. I borrowed this from my friend Johnny Maddox, who was on Dot Records in the 50s. He was my musical mentor, so to speak. And he learned it from his great aunt Zula, who'd played ragtime with an all-girls orchestra at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. So Alexander's Ragtime Band. That's a workout. Did you recognize most of those tunes? Dixie, Yankee Doodle, I played My Old Kentucky Home, Listen to the Mockingbird, and Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight. And Swanee River's in there too. If you remember the words to the song. If you want to hear the Swanee River played in ragtime, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band. So that's why I always throw that one in there. Let's do a little bit different style of music now. I try to point out in my concerts that I do not just play ragtime. I do all the different music of that era. Ragtime was the first truly original American music. Everything else we know and love came out of ragtime in one way or another. I think some of my regular listeners have probably heard this spiel before, but the next style to come along, at least in a commercial sense, was blues. And the first published blues tunes came out in 1912. I'd like to play you two songs by the man who is the true father, originator, and creator of the blues, W.C. Handy. He's from Memphis, Tennessee, and as such, we're going to do the Memphis Blues, which he wrote in 1909. The tune wasn't published until about 1912, so it's really one of the very first 12-bar blues tunes. And in the early days, blues and ragtime were played very similar. They were played up-tempo for dancing. It wasn't real slow and sad like you hear it today. So here's the Memphis Blues. Thank you, folks. Memphis Blues. We're going to do you another W.C. Handy tune. Let's do the Beale Street Blues next. If you've ever been there, you know there's a big statue of him still downtown on Beale Street in Memphis. And like I said, in the early days, the blues were not played real slow. Can you hear the difference, though? There's just a few more blue notes. That's about it. Here's the Beale Street Blues. you very much. Thank you, folks. Well, we don't want everything to be all blue and sad, so I'm going to play something different for you next. And I mentioned earlier my musical mentor, Johnny Maddox. He was probably my biggest influence as a piano player. I met him when I was 12 years old, and when I heard him play the piano, I just loved it. I wanted to play like that. And he was the only ragtime piano player that ever had a star on Hollywood Boulevard. His star is down there right next to Will Rogers. It was on Dot Records in the 50s. Between 1950 and 1967, Johnny sold 11 million records for Dot. This was his watch he gave me when he retired. Wow. And anyway, I've started doing something recently, and I want to try it out on a concert audience. And I want to try it on you because you're such an esteemed, wonderful crowd. And I've been playing a big medley of songs of all of Johnny's hit records. And so I thought I'd do that for you, then we'll take a little intermission. But I was playing this. Nick mentioned the hotel where I play in Durango. I was playing this one night, and he was sitting right next to me, and he looked up and he said, "Oh, he's playing all of my hits." So it just came to me one night. I thought, I'm gonna try this. And it's wonderful songs that you'll probably be familiar with. These are songs of the Great American Songbook that are, pop hits, but played in a little bit of a ragtime style. And these records that Johnny made were big hits in the jukeboxes of the 50s. The first one was Bob Wills' San Antonio Rose. We're going to play San Antonio Rose, and then Stardust, which Johnny recorded with Chet Atkins on guitar. And then we're going to do a tune called My Little Grass Shack. And I can't pronounce the full title, My Little Grass Shack in Kealakekua, Hawaii. And that was one of his big records. And then we'll do, let's see, I try and do them in order. The next one, Sioux City Sue. And then In the Mood was one of Johnny's big hit records. We'll do a few choruses of Glenn Miller's In the Mood. And then a tune called The Dipsy Doodle, written by band leader Larry Clinton. And then I think the next one is Josephine by Wayne King. And one of Johnny's last records to hit the Billboard charts in the late 50s was Yellow Dog Blues by W.C. Handy. I love his music. We're going to play a bunch of it tonight. And so I'm going to play this medley of tunes for you. Then we'll take a little intermission. Don't go too far. There'll be different stuff in the second half of the concert. And I do have CDs for sale. I would love not to have to lug such a big box of CDs home. So take a look at them. And in the meantime, here's my medley of the Johnny Maddox hit records. Thank you, folks. All right, stick around. Stick around.
We'll take a brief 10-minute, Adam? Sure. 10 minutes. That's enough. And you can feel free to go back and buy some CDs, support Adam's artistry, help him out, get rid of those CDs for his carry-on. And then we'll be back in 10 minutes for some more terrific music. Thank you.